me this morning. This is my first ever talk in California, so you are my virgin group, so it's awesome to be here. I will try to talk fast and still give y'all some southern accent while I am talking. About 15 years ago, I read this book, and that was not unusual for me. I've always been a really big reader. But I had just met my husband, and we had gotten married, and we thought it would impress our friends if we told them we were reading a book out loud together. It would make us sound intellectual. So we picked a book called Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose. Has anybody read that Pulitzer Prize winning book? One person. Has anybody heard of the Lewis and Clark expedition to the Pacific Ocean? Okay, so I grew up in South Carolina. If you can't tell by now, I've never lived out of the South. And we have the distinction of trading places with Mississippi for having the worst schools in the United States of America. So I didn't learn a whole lot about anything in school in South Carolina. In 8th grade, we had to take U.S. history, and I learned Lewis and Clark followed Sacagawea to the Pacific Ocean, and they came home, and that was the end, and it was this tiny little boring paragraph in my history book, and I memorized that fact to write it on a test, because that's so much of how we teach history, isn't it? We just learn a bunch of mind-numbing facts that we cannot wait to vomit on a test and forget as fast as we can, because why do we have to learn about any of these people? So I forgot about all of them for all those years. So imagine how remarkable it was to pick up Undaunted Courage at the age of 33. And I learned that Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and 31 other individuals, mostly these 20-year-old dudes, were screwing their way across North America. They were sleeping with all the Native American tribes because the Native Americans believed if they could get their women to sleep with these men, it would steal their power. And if you're a 20-year-old guy, you're apparently up for having your power stolen a lot. So they were doing upstanding things on this expedition. Clark's maps of those rivers and estuaries are still the seminal pictures of what those rivers looked like in that day. Lewis was America's first scientist. He was cataloging more new plant and animal life for science than any person living in the world in his day. So they were doing some good things, but they were having a big time on this expedition. And I thought, wow, you know, if they taught history like that when I was in the 8th grade, I probably would have majored in history. I would have been fascinated. It was the first time that people from history really came to life for me, and I wanted to learn more about them. Because we have this tendency as Americans, don't we, to treat our historical figures like those oil paintings in museums. And that was really that day's version of Photoshop. I want to look pretty, and I want to have this nose, and I want to have these clothes that I don't own, and I want all these things in the portrait that make me look smart and rich and clever and powerful. And all that, a lot of that was fake, just like Photoshop is today. And so we can't really relate to that because it's not, you know, salacious. And the salacious stuff is what makes these people interesting. You know, that's why there's reality TV today, too. So I wanted to learn more about these people. It was the first time that I learned how Meriwether Lewis, captain of that expedition, died. Who knows that story? How did he die?
Did he not? He suicide. Okay, so
suicide we have. Does anybody have another theory? Yes.
With a smile on his face.
With a smile on his face. And a song in his heart. Any other ideas? Yes.
Syphilis.
Syphilis. That, okay. Somebody did write a book about his syphilis suicide. Any other ideas? All right, if you Google Meriwether Lewis death, which you're welcome to take out your smartphones and do if you're bored, Google will tell you that he committed suicide on the Natchez Trace, 70 miles south of Nashville, Tennessee. It was October 11th, 1809. He was 35 years old, 3 years after the expedition ended. The suicide crowd say that he could not handle his political responsibilities as territorial governor of Upper Louisiana, and he spiraled into depression and drink. One of them says he had severe syphilis as well, and he killed himself. He shot himself once in the head, and that did not kill him, so he shot himself again in the gut, and he died. If you Google Meriwether Lewis murder, you can read for hours all the different conspiracy theories of who might have wanted to whack him on the Natchez Trace, because apparently a lot of people wanted him dead. And there are all these theories about that out there online. The official position of the U.S. government is that he died under mysterious circumstances. His death is one of America's great unsolved mysteries. We don't know what happened that night. And there is no real record of what happened. The only person who was there changed her story 3 times between the time it happened and the time she died 50 years later. She's not very reliable. There was no federal investigation into his death because the Natchez Trace south of Nashville was the middle of freaking nowhere, so they couldn't get anybody out there to see what happened. So because of the taint of suicide and mental illness, which we still don't know what to do with that today, do we? But in 1809, that was not a very manly way to die. So he was immediately forgotten by history. He was buried in a dirt hole next to the Natchez Trace, which was a dirt trail at the time. They didn't bury him deep enough the first time, so some wild animals dug him up and dragged him around the clearing. They had to dig a deeper hole and they put trash on it. He lay in a hole with trash on it for almost 50 years, an unmarked grave. In 1848, the legislature of the state of Tennessee thought it was appalling that this American hero was buried in their state without a marker. So they exhumed him and erected the monument that you'll see in a little while in my slideshow. I thought that was really sad because, you know, he accomplished so much in 35 years. What might he have done if he could do something else? And I wondered what that would look like, and I have a really hyperactive imagination, so I decided I wanted to write a story about him and give him another chapter. And I couldn't do that unless I wrote this Afterlife story, because I didn't want to write a history book. I can't make stuff up. When you write history books, you kind of get in trouble for that, and I wanted to make stuff up. So I decided to exhume him and write an afterlife paranormal historical suspense thriller. There's not even a genre for that on Amazon, but I'm a reader, and I thought readers really want to read interesting books. They don't want to read the same thing over and over and over again. I'm an idiot. And so I wrote this paranormal historical thriller, and I was so excited about it, and I queried it to 100 agents, and they all rejected it because they said, you have to pick a genre. Nobody knows what that is. Nobody is going to read that, and you're an idiot. But this was my book, baby. This was the book that I had to write to read, and I wanted it to be that book, and I thought I'm probably never going to make any money as an author. Anyway, so I found a small press in South Carolina who was willing to publish my book, baby, as I wrote it, and on March the 1st, 2014, all y'all and everybody on earth was going to be able to read my book, baby, and I wanted everybody to read my book, baby, because I was proud of it. But how do y'all decide what to read? Because Oprah was not going to be picking my book, baby, for her book club. And you were not going to be able to go into the library in Glendale and say, I want this paranormal historical thriller by Andra Watkins. They would have looked at you like you had 4 heads. And none of your friends were going to be telling you to read this book. So I had a real uphill battle to get people to pick my book, baby. But I decided that if I did something really audacious to launch this book, I would maybe get more people to read it. So I decided I was going to walk the 444-mile Natchez Trace Parkway with cars and trucks and camper vans where this book was set, and I would do it in 15-mile-a-day increments every day for 34 days, and I would take readers into the world of this book, and I would blog about it and do these YouTube videos, and I thought by the time I get to the middle of Mississippi, since nobody does anything like this, I'm going to start getting on the news and getting in newspapers, and people will start following this online, and by the time I get to Nashville, I might sell hundreds or even thousands of this book, baby, because of all the press I generate from doing this walk. And I might even hit the New York Times bestseller list, and people might come and put me on the national news, and I might have people at the end coming to meet me. And I'm so smart, and I'm so clever, so even though I cannot run a mile without falling over, I am going to walk 15 miles every day on a highway for 34 days, because it's just walking. I mean, how hard can that be? So I started training around my house in Charleston, South Carolina on dirt trails about 3 months before the book came out, and just threw myself into that, and I was a complete, utter idiot. I had no idea how stupid I was. And it's a good thing, because I wouldn't be here today if I didn't. But I had one problem with my little plan. The Natchez Trace is still a pretty remote place. Has anybody been to the Natchez Trace? Have you heard of it? a few of you. I mean, I grew up in the South, and I'd never heard of it until I read Undaunted Courage, so y'all are fine. But the Natchez Trace is a 10,000-year-old road. We throw out numbers and don't give much perspective to that. So to give you some sense of how old that is, it's older than the pyramids in Egypt. And it's always been used as a road. It was traced out by animals migrating, that's why it's called a trace. When the Native Americans came to that part of America, they settled along the Natchez Trace to follow their migrating food supply. So there are mound structures that those peoples built that are thousands of years old along that corridor. And that land changed hands for several hundred years between the Spanish and the French and the English and back before it became a part of the United States. So it's a very interesting cultural corridor. It is our national tunnel through time. All of those peoples have traces of themselves along it. And it is a national parkway today. So most people drive it. It's paved. Some people ride their motorcycles on it. Some people bicycle it. My husband has done some of it on his bike. But I was going to be walking it. And so I needed a wingman. I needed somebody to drop me off at 1 milepost and pick me up 15 mileposts later every day because I'm girly and I was not camping and I wanted to sleep in a real bed every night and take a real shower after doing this hard thing. And I had a lot of people in my life who could help me. I went to my husband first and said, you know, this is hard and I'm not an athlete and I don't want to be away from you for 5 weeks. But he has this really stressful job in Charleston, South Carolina that still even today pays for my stupid proclivity to write. So he could not take 5 weeks off of his job to schlep me around Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee. So I scratched him off my list, but that was no problem. I have all these girlfriends, and they're always complaining about their husbands and their children and their jobs and soccer practice. And so I went to all them and I said, you could go with me for a few days and get away from all that, and we'll have a Thelma and Louise adventure together, and it'll be awesome, and we'll have a big time. And then you can go back to all that stress, but you will have gotten away and had a break. And several of them were really excited about the thought of that, but their husbands and their children and their employers were not so enamored. So I ended up with one friend who could do it with me at the beginning for 4 days. I had this chasm of time, 30 days, and no wingman, and only one name left on my scribbled out list, and it was my 80-year-old father. We all have at least one of these people in our lives, don't we? These people who drive us absolutely, utterly insane. And for me, that was my 80-year-old father. We have never gotten along. I could not stand to be in the same room with him. He was that person for me, and we all have one. It's usually a family member where you go and you visit them and you grit your teeth through the hours that you have to spend with them so that you can skip out of the house and check off a box and say, thank God I don't have to do that again for 6 months. That was my dad. I mean, spending 5 weeks living in hotel rooms with him was the worst thing I could imagine. But I was desperate for my New York Times best-selling debut novel, and I just knew if I pulled this stunt, I would have it. So I sucked it up, and I went to his house, and I went in there, and I knew where I would find him, and there he was in his recliner. The house is vibrating from the sound of the TV because he can't hear anything, and he never wears his hearing aids. He's got popcorn all over the place. I mean, he's just giving me a big fat preview of what I'm going to be living with for 5 weeks in hotel rooms, but I ignored all that, and I said, Dad, you are just sitting in this recliner waiting to die, and you don't have anything to do, and so you need to get up out of this recliner and come with me and help me do this walk because I need to do this to get my New York Times best-selling debut novel. I finally figured out what I want to be when I grow up, and it's a parent's responsibility to help their children achieve their dreams, however long it takes us to figure them out. So you need to help me do this, and maybe I'll finally figure out who you are before you die, and we'll connect or something. I mean, probably not, but, you know, at least you can help me because you don't have anything to do. So what do you say, Dad? Do you want to go and do this with me? And he said, spending 5 weeks with you sounds like the worst thing I've ever heard of. I'm not going. So I had to regroup, didn't I? As an author, I had not put my reader in my story very well, had I? I had made it all about me. So I went back to my dad. And I said, Dad, you are the biggest Southern Gothic man I know, and you have all these stories you like to tell, and I've heard them all 5 billion times, but you really like to tell them to strangers. And there are all these strangers in these tiny towns along the Natchez Trace in Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee, and they've not met you, and they've not heard your stories. So while I'm walking 5 hours a day, you can go into those towns and do the Roy show, and they'll love you. And there are Southern dining establishments in these towns, Dad, and they just fry everything to death, and it tastes so good. And you can eat as much of that crap as you want. And Mom won't know, and I won't tell her. So what do you say, Dad? Do you want to do that every day for 5 weeks? And he said, that sounds amazing. I cannot wait to get started. My people are waiting to meet me. And so I had my wingman. I was going to have my New York Times best-selling debut novel, and I went into the other room to celebrate, and I banged my head against the wall because I don't want to live with my 80-year-old dad for 5 weeks. I mean, he has gas, and he scratches himself all night, and he sleeps with a CPAP machine that makes all this noise. And I was going to have to share a bathroom with my father, which was even more horrifying. I'm sure you've seen him by now. He's got this big gut, and he doesn't aim very well. But he was all in. He was not backing out on me. So on March the 1st, 2014, To Live Forever, An Afterlife Journey of Meriwether Lewis was published, and I started walking from milepost 0 outside of Natchez, Mississippi, on the Natchez Trace Parkway. And I walked for 2 days. And on the morning of the 3rd day, I was 30 miles in, and I woke up, and it was 20 degrees, and it was sleeting in southern Mississippi, which for me was a problem. I am not used to that kind of weather. And people were following this all over the world, and they were texting, and I mean, Deborah was one of them, and calling and emailing me saying, don't go today, Andrew, because there's ice on the road and somebody might run over you, or why don't you just quit? You know, just quit, because you've probably sold all the books you're going to sell by now, and nobody cares whether you do this to yourself and finish this or not. But I knew by the morning of the 3rd day just how stupid this idea was. I had trained, remember I said, on dirt trails around my house in Charleston. Well, the entire Southern Trace goes through a swamp, and I had planned to walk on the shoulder, but there was no shoulder to walk on in southern Mississippi, so I'd walk 30 miles on pavement. When you do not train on a hard surface and you walk on one, it doesn't just tear up your feet. My feet were already broken open and bloody, but my hips and my knees and my ankles were on fire from this hard surface, and I knew that I was not adding 5 or 10 miles to a day to finish on April 3rd, and I had to be in Nashville on April 3rd because Ann Patchett, a way more famous writer than me, owns a bookstore there, and she said, you can come into my store and you can talk about this stupidness, but you can only do it on the day you finish, and you have to talk about what it was like to finish walking the Natchez Trace Parkway as a woman by yourself. And so when somebody gives you an opportunity like that, you do not go into their establishment and say, I quit on the 3rd day because it was really hard, but I'm here to do my talk. They don't think very highly of that, do they? So I got out there and I walked for 2 days in sleet and sub-zero wind chill. I walked through a tornado warning. I walked through some pretty significant hail. I walked through a windstorm that was blowing more than 50 to 60 mile-an-hour wind gusts, blowing me into the road in front of cars and trucks and camper vans one day. Whatever the weather was, I was out there walking my daily 15. By the middle of the 2nd week, I was shredded. I was crawling to the bathroom every morning from how cramped up I was from the toll this was taking on me, physically, my limbs. And I was walking like C-3PO in Star Wars, you know, for the first couple of miles every day until I got loosened up enough to finish. But the physical agony that I was in was nothing compared to the agony of living with my 80-year-old father. We were fighting every breath. He forgot to pick me up one day at milepost 135 in the middle of Mississippi, and there is nothing there but some pine trees, and I had no cell signal to call him, so I just had to stand there and wait for him to quit doing whatever he was doing and remember to come pick me up. By the time he showed up, we had a nuclear holocaust of an argument. It was the worst argument we've ever had. We were both screaming at each other and calling my mother independently saying, you've got to come out here and save us. We're going to kill each other. And she said, ha ha, I'm not getting in the middle of that. So we ignored each other for a couple of days and just avoided each other. And he dropped me off at milepost 165 in the middle of Mississippi. If you go to milepost 180 in the middle of Mississippi, there's an astronomical observatory there because that is the darkest sky east of the Mississippi River, to give you a sense of how much nothing is in the middle of Mississippi. So I started walking from milepost 165, and at milepost 167, I got this horrible stomach cramp. Now, I'm girly, but I'd gotten used to going to the bathroom outside of my walk because the trace is set up for cars. and I was going to have to add miles to my day to find a real bathroom, and I was not doing that. So I found trees and bushes and whatever, but this was different. I was violently ill at milepost 165. I had 3 bouts of horrible diarrhea, and I was sobbing because I could not call my dad. I did not have a cell signal, and I was so embarrassed from this happening. Even nobody was there, nobody could see, but it was still awful. So I couldn't call my dad to tell him I was too sick to finish the day. So I went into my backpack to get out my toilet paper to clean up, and I only had 2 squares because I had not checked my supply that morning. So I got out the only other thing I had with me, a big bottle of Gatorade, and I took the lid off and I dumped it around back there and swished it around. And if you're ever in that predicament, don't do that because it's really sticky. So I cleaned up as best I could, and I pulled everything up, and I got back out on the white line sobbing and looking at my phone, saying as soon as I have a signal, I'm calling my dad and I'm telling him to come get me because this is the worst idea anybody's ever had in history. And I'm a failure. I'm not selling any of that book. Nobody's interviewing me for the news. Nobody's paying attention to this. None of my readers are even calling me in week 2. And I'm miserable, and I want to go home, and I'm going to be a failure and work at a coffee shop and be happy with that because I cannot do this anymore. So about 2 miles more of sobbing and looking at my phone without a signal, and I just went and collapsed in a field that I saw off to the right. And I said, maybe eventually Roy Watkins will wonder where I am. Might be tomorrow, and I'll just lie in this field until he comes looking for me. I don't care how long it has to be because I'm done. I'm finished. I cannot do this anymore. And I lay in that field for about 15 minutes. If you've not been to the South in the spring, I highly recommend it. It's beautiful. It's before we get all that soupy humidity in the air. And everything was budding out and blooming, and birds were migrating. And I looked around, and I was lying in a field of thousands of daffodils. And after about 15 minutes of feeling horrifically sorry for myself, I thought, you know, I've been doing this walk like I live my whole life. And like so many people in the 21st century live so much of life, I've been rushing through every day to get finished because I was focused on how much my feet hurt and how miserable I was. And because I was focused on that, I was missing all the amazing things that were happening to me every day because I was walking a highway nobody walks by myself. Thousands of birds would fly out of the woods and fly all around me. A deer came out and walked right here next to me one day for more than a mile and didn't run away. A woodpecker stayed with me all day one day and plonked trees on either side of the road, and it was like we were having a conversation. I had numerous experiences like that with nature, and people were stopping and talking to me from as far away as Japan and telling me their Natchez Trace stories and what they were doing there, and I was missing all of that amazing stuff because I was focused on the misery and the agony of every day. And we do that in 2017, don't we? I mean, we all have these devices that never stop burping and chirping and twerping and asking for our time. We have to-do lists that are longer than we can ever complete. We open the news today and either celebrate or want to kill ourselves over what we see, and everybody's angry with each other, and we all hate each other, and there's so much stress and anger and upset in the world right now. And that's all our metaphorical feet hurting, isn't it? Because every day there's something about life that's amazing. But if we have a string of days like that where it's just all awful, it's easy to focus on that, isn't it? And we forget to focus on the amazing things. So the next time you're having one of those days or a series of those days, I hope you'll remember me in that field of daffodils, and you'll pull your head up out of that, and you'll find the amazing thing in your day, because every single day of life has an amazing thing. That is what life is, and it will be there for you if you choose to see it. I finished my walk on time and on schedule on April 3rd, 2014. I did my talk at the bookstore in Nashville. I had a few people come out to the end to meet me, and I sold a few copies of Not Without My Father and got on some regional news. I didn't sell enough to hit the New York Times bestseller list, but I did that with my book about this adventure, Not Without My Father, so I eventually hit it with my second book. So I accomplished some of what I set out to do, but the best thing that ended up happening to me from this entire experience ended up being the 5 weeks that I spent with my 80-year-old dad, who drives me insane, and the 3 weeks I spent with my mom, because she did end up and coming out to help us. I've probably done this talk 1,000 times. I do this talk for whoever will give me an opportunity, whether they pay me or not. As a Rotarian, it's an honor to just do it for you and give you a good program, and I hope you've enjoyed it. But I do this because we all have people in our lives that we're losing a little bit every day, and they're usually that person like my dad. And so we say, I'm going to put off doing that thing because they're hard, and I'll do it when I have money, or I'll do it when I have time, or I'll do it someday. And we all have people that we regret we can't do something with now. We all have regrets. That's part of life, and I'm not here to dredge those up for you. You have somebody that you need to make a memory with, and I hope you'll go out of here and you'll say, let's do that thing. Let's don't wait. Let's do it now. I'm so glad I did that with my dad. He told me stories that I had not heard 5 billion times, and we really did connect. And those stories that he told me and those memories that we made are what I'll have when he's gone if I outlast him. That's the only way we can be immortal and live forever, is to make these memories and have them when these people are gone. I'm so grateful for that time that I spent with my dad. And I hope you'll go out of here and do the same thing and tell me about it. I love opening my email and hearing these stories from all over the place. So I hope you'll do that. I am standing here today because I read one book, Undaunted Courage, 15 years ago. I haven't found all these adventures in one book. And as a writer, it makes me so sad for people to say they don't have time to read anymore. So I have some books you can buy. They're 1 for $15, 2 for $25, and all 3 for $35. My latest book is about Theodosia Burr. If you've seen Hamilton in Los Angeles, she's Dear Theodosia, who was Aaron Burr's daughter. And she disappeared when she was 29, and so that gave me the impetus to write an afterlife story for her. So they're all 3 for $35. I'll take your check. I have a square, and I have change, so you don't have an excuse not to get them all. You get a free voodoo doll if you get them all. So if you're not a reader, get them for somebody. Christmas is coming, and I give a percentage of all books sold at Rotary clubs to Rotary literacy initiatives, because Rotary literacy teaches people to find these adventures in reading, and I'm honored to do that. If I have time for questions, I'll take them. Okay, yes?
So, I must say, I'm curious, one of this, how far was this race?
444 miles.
And what did you learn that you didn't expect to learn? Because you told us a great story about what occurred to you, but not maybe about the reason that you went there. And you recently wrote your book about this stuff.
The reason that I went there was just a completely selfish thing that I thought I'd become.
While you were talking, all these people walking all those miles, is there anything that you learned about your subject, Meriwether, that you didn't know before? You got all this local...
I didn't learn anything about him that I didn't know before,
okay.
But on my birthday, I was walking in northern Mississippi, and I looked down, and it was about where most historians agree he rode onto the Trace to ride to his death, because he didn't do the whole thing.
Right.
And I looked down, and there was a Lewis and Clark nickel, tails up, on the white line. My husband was with me that day, and he'd stepped over it. And what's interesting about that is I had carried a Lewis and Clark nickel in my backpack the whole time, and when I got to his grave, I was going to leave it on his grave. It was this pristine thing, a gift for him to thank him for giving me all this inspiration. And so on my birthday, I found this nickel on the road, and my husband, who's an agnostic, looked at me and said, "That is your birthday present for Meriwether Lewis. He gave you that." And so he had it made into a bracelet for me that I wear, and I gave my nickel to Lewis. And I really do truly believe he participated in this story, in this adventure. Yes?
Was your father, is your father was driver's license, did he have?
Have you ever been asked this question before?
Did my father have a driver's license? Yes, he did. I don't know how he does. I mean, my dad is 83 now, and as a child, it isn't very often that you get to make your parents' life and see that you've done that. And he goes out every day and sells this book about him, and it has really extended his life. He loves it, and he thinks he's such a celebrity. And when the book hit the New York Times bestseller list, I called him and I said, "Dad, the book about you is on the New York Times bestseller list today. What do you think of that?" "Well, them people up there in New York must like me." He had no idea what hitting the New York Times meant at all. But I mean, he has just loved this. So, and he's doing really well. And we talk most days, and our relationship is completely different. And he still has a license. Yes?
Have you considered Gatorade as a sponsor?
I don't know that Gatorade would want to have anything to do with that. I really don't think they would. Yes?
Being a cyclist and riding a two-lane road with no shoulder, I mean, any near-death experiences or?
You're gonna have to get the book.
Okay.
Because I had several. I mean, that was a very brief. There were wild animals and crazy people, and this was not very far from where that girl was burned to death about a month after I finished. So, I mean, there are some mean people everywhere, but there is a concentration of them in Mississippi. I didn't just say that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Just a little gift, and this is a thank you gift for being here today with us, and it just speaks to our theme of good is the new cool, which basically has to do with the choices that we make. That really not only impacts us, but other people where we are and around the world. So this is a bracelet that was made by a woman trying to lift her family out of poverty. So you are here today and you helped someone across the globe. And then since you admired the pin, now you can talk about the Alex Theater with everybody, and there's one for you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.